Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is another episode of Saturdays with Dad. Do you want to introduce today's video?
I've been asked to provide my top 10 albums, my top 10 albums of the 60s. And without further ado,
So I'm going to pick a random one, and you're just going to talk about it.
We're just going to do them random.
So they're not in any order?
None in order, rather.
Well, you have a favourite one.
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin?
Shall I say, arguably the greatest rock band to come out of England, Led Zeppelin. Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, John Bonham and John Paul Jones. First album, absolutely magnificent. This sort of heavy combination of blues and also rhythm and blues as well as prog rock. My favourite track on this is Dazed and Confused, which is absolutely magnificent. And I couldn't go into a top 10 album from the 60s without not having this album in it. Ooh. This is coming towards the end of 69. And this is the Fleetwood Mac album, Then Play On. Fleetwood Mac, obviously, most people out there know the Fleetwood Mac of Rumours and Tango in the Night and things like that. But before they went to the States, they were extremely incredible British blues band. And in this album, which is an American pressing, it has some of the great songs on here. The Green Manalishi, Oh Well, Rattlesnake Shake. And this is just the example here of great guitar work by predominantly the late lamented Peter Green. Again, I have to have this in my top 10.
Do you like the Fleetwood Mac with the new members?
That's good, but to me, Fleetwood Mac would always be the British blues band. I mean, don't get me wrong, Rumours is a fantastic album, but it's just my personal preference. Ooh, Bob Dylan, Highway 61 Revisited. Well, the great Bob Dylan. What can I say? This is a great folk album. Came out in the early 60s. It's got some fantastic, like a Rolling Stone. It's just a wonderful album. What a poet Bob Dylan is, and probably a lot of people would say maybe Blonde on Blonde would be their favourite album of the 60s Dylan, but I just love this one, and this and the one that came later in the 70s, Blood on the Tracks, but this is an amazing album. West Coast stuff, yeah. The Doors, Strange Days. Interesting one because, again, a lot of people will look at the first album with, things like The End on it. But as great as that album is, I prefer this one. There's some fantastic stuff. When the music's over, it's just unbelievable. And just all sort of things like Your Lost Little Girl, My Eyes Have Seen You. It's just a great album. It's possibly my favourite Doors album. This is Strange Days by the Doors. I suppose you don't really mention the 60s without mentioning this group, the Beatles. And for me, I'm a latter-day Beatles person, from sort of like Rubber Soul and Revolver onwards. And I think of all the albums that they made and all the most magnificent songs that they wrote, this collection of songs in the White Album is my favourite. A lot of my favourite Beatles songs are on this album. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Sexy Sadie, Back in the USSR, Dear Prudence, it's all on this album. It is simply magnificent. It's so beautiful. A lot of the George Harrison stuff on here is fantastic. And just a little addendum here to people who may or may not know, I'm sure you do, but the track written by him, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, was actually, the solo was played by Eric Clapton.
And you saw the Beatles live, didn't you?
Yeah, I saw them. My cousin took my brother and I when we were very young. I mean, we were, I think, 9 or something, or 10, to see their concert at the Hammersmith, as it was then, the Hammersmith Odeon, with bands like Jerry and the Pacemakers and Freddie and the Dreamers. But the 2 young boys that were myself and my brother couldn't really hear the Beatles when they came on. There were too many fainting and screaming girls. We're now going from the experimental pop rock for the Beatles to the experimental jazz. A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. When I say the late lamented John Coltrane, the man who died at a ridiculously young age, who was on the sessions with Miles Davis and Bill Evans in Kind of Blue. And this is his crowning glory to me. Surrealistic Pillow by Jefferson Airplane. Incredible album. I think people know by now my love of West Coast music, jam bands and progressive and psychedelic rock. And into that category comes this album, Surrealistic Pillow. It's got the great numbers on it, Somebody to Love, White Rabbit. You know, it's just, to me, a great album. Paul Kantner, Grace Slick, Marty Balin. The wonderfulness that is Jack Cassidy and Jorma Kaukonen, who are just 2 great musicians who went on to form Hot Tuna. But this album was an unbelievable one. This is Surrealistic Pillow by Jefferson Airplane. Right, I think, you know, there have been some great guitarists in the 60s, and, you know, from Eric Clapton, George Harrison, Jerry, you know, some amazing guitarists. But the guitarist to me that summed up the 60s, without a doubt, James Marshall Hendrix. For me, and this is my top 10, I have to have Electric Ladyland. Now, I know a lot of people like, you know, Axis Bowler's Love, but I know particularly you like that album, don't you?
That's probably would be in my top 10.
But for me, Electric Ladyland has so much memory for me, and it's got some, not just Voodoo Child, but the long version of Voodoo Child. It's just got so much crosstown traffic. It's just fantastic. So I would definitely have to put this album in my top 10. As I said, James Marshall Hendrix, probably the guitarist, the greatest guitarist of all time, but certainly summed up the 60s in a way for me. Right, made just before the turn of the decade in 1969. This is Live Dead. To me, and it's a personal thing, I love this group so much, and this album here encapsulates my love. This is wonderful. From Death Don't Have No Mercy, Feedback, you know, The 11, you know, St. Stephen, but also the most unbelievable sound of Dark Star. This to me is seminal dead. One of the, certainly to me, one of the greatest live bands of all time. I managed to see them twice. I was lucky. Both times in England. I never got to see them in the States. Once at Wembley in 72 and once at the Alexandra Palace in 74. And, you know, to me, they are seminal. And this album is one of the great albums of the 60s, albeit late 60s, about 69.
And last, this deserves its own little section of the video.
Right, this album, if someone said to me, what's your top 100? I'd say well, it's going to take a long time for you to come out and tell me what my top 100 albums or what my top 10 albums is, all prog and everything. But if someone said to me, what is the greatest album of all time for you? Step Forward, Brian and the Lads, Pet Sounds. I could go through all the tracks. I know them back to front. I know all the songs. I've heard this album hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. To me, it is not just one of the great albums of the 60s, it is the defining album, full stop. It has influenced everyone from Paul McCartney to Radiohead, to Fish, to all the great bands. And I imagine probably people in Black Sabbath and Tool, they probably have a copy of this album. Everyone who likes proper music loves this album. It is the #1 album, and I would imagine probably be in your top 10 albums of all time.
Probably would be, yeah.
Yeah. So I've saved the best for last. Pet Sounds, The Beach Boys.
That's the end of the video. Any final thoughts? Closing words?
Yeah, well, 60s obviously for me as I was growing up, in the 60s I was a young boy. But to me it was like the formative experimental decade. And we had obviously the jazz influence of Miles Davis and such, and the big bands of the 50s and 40s. And even the sort of early Beatles stuff, which was very, very sort of like rock and roll and everything like that. By the time the mid-60s came around, there was so much interesting stuff going on.
When prog started out.
Yeah, and then, prog started out, it's arguable who started it. My slant on it is probably Procol Harum, but there'll be other people who disagree. But to me, the 60s was a great decade of pure inventiveness and, prepared people for what was going to happen in the 70s. But as I say, for me, those are my best albums of the 60s.
Right, thank you for watching, everyone. I'll see you in tomorrow's video. Bye.
Bye. See you next week.